I've talked about the OVA boom of the 90s a few times on this channel so far, mostly in the context of the Gundam franchise. Of course, OVAs were incredibly lucrative and popular outside of the Gundam series, and there's no shortage of mecha OVA content to watch in particular. In October of 1988, an animation studio called Gainax would release the first 2 episodes in their new sci-fi mecha OVA. Originally named Aim for the Top, Gunbuster is a fun series about love, space monsters, time dilation, and of course, giant robots. Most importantly, Gunbuster marks the directorial debut of Hideaki Anno, who would later go on to direct a little-known show, maybe you've heard of it, Neon Genesis Evangelion. EVA would go on to be one of the best-known anime of all time, with posters adorning every nerd's room in the early 2000s. But before Evangelion came a show called Gunbuster. While this show is much shorter than something like Evangelion, being only 6 episodes long, its scope is insanely large. It's actually impressive how much they managed to cram into the series' runtime with a story that scope spans thousands of years, and includes complex science that, whether it's realistic or not, is definitely well thought out. Gunbuster would go on to spawn a sequel in the mid-2000s named Diebuster, as well as a couple of compilation movies to boot. Personally, I've never seen anything in this franchise, but I do know that it seems to be fairly popular among mecha fans and fans of old-school 90s anime. I happen to enjoy both, so I'm hoping that this series lives up to the hype. So let's get into Aim for the Top, Gunbuster, and see how humanity fares when faced up against creatures from the center of the galaxy. Gunbuster opens with our protagonist, Noriko Takaya, attending an academy for piloting machine weapons, the mechs of the series. Noriko hopes to do well with piloting as she wants to be chosen to join the Earth military space fleet in order to defend her home from the space monsters. These nebulous adversaries aren't shown at the beginning of the series, adding to their mysterious aura. Thus, at first, they are a faceless threat, and we only know that 6 years prior to the start of the series, Noriko's father, Admiral Takaya, was killed in the opening battle of the war. This makes our main character immediately relatable and her motivations completely understandable. When we see Noriko struggle later and we ask ourselves why she's putting herself through such hardship, I just remember her motivations. Gunbuster is a series with a rather bleak setting, and despite its colorful exterior full of 90s jazzercise pop outfits, it can be rather dark, and with some of the things that happen to the characters in this show, rather sad as well. But we will get to all that in time. For now, we have Noriko, who has a very obvious crush on an upperclassman, Kazumi Amano. Amano is the best RX-7 pilot at the school, and as such is a shoo-in to be picked as one of the machine weapon pilots. This gives Noriko another motivator as she wishes to prove herself to Amano. Despite not being a very good pilot and not taking her training incredibly seriously, Noriko is picked as one of the chosen pilots and partnered with Amano. It seems that the person in charge of picking the pilots is Coach Koichiro Oda, a former soldier who served directly with Admiral Takaya, Noriko's father. Of course, this leads to accusations of nepotism, and Noriko suffers some unwarranted bullying until she finally snaps at Coach Oda and asks him if he picked her as a joke. It's when he tells her that he believes in her that Noriko finally starts to believe in her own potential, and we get a good old training montage. Noriko is challenged to a duel by another classmate, and despite knowing about it, Oda chooses not to stop the combat. She's on the defensive from the beginning, being taunted over the radio and toyed with relentlessly by her rival. Finally, Noriko is able to pull off a move called the Lightning Kick, a technique that wins her the duel and also hasn't been taught to her yet. This proves Oda right in choosing Noriko, as she has a natural ability that he believes will be invaluable during the battles to come. This first fight that Noriko takes part in goes a long way to sell the animation of Gunbuster. There's some great camera work and really solid animation behind the way that the machine weapons move. I really like this one shot in particular where the character dissolves into the mech they're piloting. It's a really nice touch and creative cinematography is appreciated. At the start of episode 2, we learn that the relationship between Ota and Admiral Takaya was even closer than previously thought, as Takaya personally saved Ota from certain death. Noriko and Amano arrive in space and witness the brand new flagship named the Evangelion being built in orbit. This ship is massive, and the amount of detail that goes into some of the panning shots here is incredibly impressive. The Evangelion will be the spearhead in an operation to take the fight to the space monsters, although it will take 7 months before it's fully completed and armed. In the meantime, the RX-7 pilots will be training and getting to know one another. One of these ace pilots is Soviet redhead Jung Freud. Jung is a hotshot pilot, and having heard that Amano is already skilled right out of the academy, piques her interest enough to challenge her to an impromptu duel during a training exercise. Of course, this duel doesn't go completely according to plan, and the trio eventually wander into an off-limits area where they discover the corpse of the series' adversary, the space monster. And man, this thing is pretty gnarly looking, like a cross between a crab and a flea or something. Thought of these things flying around in space waiting to eat me gives me the heebie-jeebies, and they make for a really interesting enemy. I always find aliens that are completely unknowable to be much more interesting monsters, and if there's one thing that the space monsters can be called, it's alien. They don't seem to communicate, though they are incredibly deadly. Also, I'm a sucker for biological spacefaring species like the Zerg from StarCraft and Tyranids from 40k, so these giant flying space fleas are kinda right up my alley. Before the trio can admire the horror in all its glory, a military scanner picks them up and reports their location back to the training ship, the Silver Star, and they're retrieved and reprimanded for being dumb. Oh yeah, also, this is a 90s OVA, so here's the obligatory bath scene with full nudity. Sound the alarm. Along with the nudity alarm is another alarm as the fleet picks up a large object moving through space at light speed nearby. Oda decides that this is the perfect chance to test the abilities of Amano and Noriko, so he straps them to some huge outboard motors and fires them off at light speed to intercept whatever it is. Lightspeed travel in Gunbuster looks pretty damn cool as stars turn into multicolored streaks, and the sound of the engine drowns out most other noises. Space travel in this show is pretty interesting, actually, as not only do you have to deal with things like G-forces and navigation, but also time dilation. Distance from the Earth, as well as different gravitational pulls, cause the pilots and crew members to experience time at a different rate than those still back on Earth. So while initially the RX-7 pilots had 7 months to train, Noriko and Amano undertake this mission understanding that by the time that they're back, almost 6 months will have passed. This becomes a huge part of the series' themes later, so I'll come back to it, but for now this just adds a whole nother layer of anxiety over everything else. The lightspeed object ends up being the Luxion, the ship captained by Noriko's father. Upon learning this, Noriko freaks out and boards, heading for the bridge. Ota and Amano go after her, warning her not to go there. Once Noriko makes it there, however, she finds that the bridge has been completely destroyed. In fact, it's literally just gone. We also learn that only 2 days have passed aboard the Luxion, further illustrating the effect of time dilation. The team returns to the Silver Star to find the work on the Evangelion completed, and Noriko worries that she's missed out on too much training because of the mission. The fleet, led by the Evangelion, finally launches on its mission to take the fight to the space monsters. These enemies are much farther away than the Luxion was, so instead of using light speed travel, the ships have to use warp speed. This requires essentially creating a gate between 2 points in space using black holes and jumping through the subspace between them. It's complicated, and I'm sure someone in the comments can probably explain better how it works than I can, but it's super cool. Before the fleet can arrive at their location, an enemy flies past them in subspace and they decide to pursue. The captain orders the ship to use the gravitational pull of the nearby star, Leaf 64, to slingshot them back the way they came. However, upon leaving subspace, the Exelion finds that Leaf 64 is a red giant, which is really bad because it's supposed to be a yellow dwarf, much like our own sun. Side note, our sun isn't actually a yellow dwarf, but a lot of people say it is, so the more you know. This is especially strange because the star should not have decayed into a red giant yet, but with more important matters to attend to, the fleet decides to leave and chase down that enemy in subspace. While all this is happening, Amano has an intense conversation with Coach Ota, telling him that she cannot be partnered with Noriko any longer. On the outside, Amano seems angry, like she's upset that Noriko just isn't good enough to be her partner, but we can see that it's mostly that she's scared for Noriko's safety. Amano quits as Noriko's partner, causing her to go into a period of self-searching depression. It's then that Noriko is approached by Smith Torin. Smith met Noriko once before when they were both sentenced to cleaning duty for sneaking around the ship in the dark. Also, he looks like Vosh the Stampede, so that's pretty sweet. He offers to be Noriko's battle partner, as he's currently alone himself, and the two start getting along quite well, and Noriko agrees, deciding to make the best of the situation. The Exelion fleet and enemy fleet finally collide, causing all the machine weapon pilots to launch into defensive positions. It's here that Noriko is faced with life or death combat for the first time, and the reality of her situation causes her to completely freeze. The combat doesn't last long, and at the end Noriko returns alone with no sign of Smith anywhere. She blames herself for Smith's death, and knowing that if she had been able to back him up, they may have both lived. The fleet realizes that this was a trap, and that the main enemy force is now assembled back at Leaf 64, where they were headed. Noriko tells Oda that she can't be a pilot, and once again he tells her just to believe in herself like he believes in her, and that's why he chose her to pilot the Gunbuster. And yeah, this is the first time we see the series' titular mech, however, it's still under construction. Noriko takes Oda's words to heart and begins a training regimen with him. At the end of the episode, we learn from one of the ship's scientists that the prevailing theory on space monsters is that they use stars as hatching grounds, which would explain why Leaf 64 had already decayed into a red giant. This realization also puts into perspective just how outnumbered the human fleet really is. And once they realize how outnumbered they are, the captain decides to return to Earth and write this entire mission off as a recon mission. Young, seeing that Noriko has been getting special training with Oda, challenges her to a duel to see what she's learned. Noriko reluctantly agrees, but despite her increased training, she freaks out as soon as she steps out into space, calling out Smith's name. This sends Noriko into another bout of depression and self-questioning. She even sits out a battle as the fleet comes into contact with the enemy while inside subspace. The battle is absolutely brutal, with the majority of the fleet being lost. At the last minute, Noriko decides that she would rather fight instead of accept her fate and make the deaths of Smith and her father mean something. Noriko boards the recently completed Gunbuster, and despite being told it's not fully equipped, she takes it out into the fight anyway. This is the first time we see Gunbuster in all its glory, standing defiantly atop the ship. Man, this mech is cool. I really love how it still retains the simplicity of the series' other machines, but just exudes confidence and power. That seems to be well-deserved as well, as we see the Gunbuster absolutely wipe the floor with the smaller space monsters. Noriko engages the leader of the enemy fleet and not only destroys it, but miraculously survives. The Exelion, being the only ship left in the fleet, limps home to Earth after having bought humanity one more day of survival. But how long can that really last? We are now in Okinawa, Japan in the year 2032, and while only 7 months have passed in space, 10 years have gone by on Earth. Noriko and Amano are hailed as victorious pilots and finally graduate from the academy, although everybody that they originally attended with has moved on. This is where the real gravity and horror of space travel in Gunbuster really comes to a head. Noriko basically sacrificed everything to try and complete this mission and get revenge for her father. Imagine the world skipping ahead 10 years while you were away. It's a crazy concept. Kimiko, Noriko's best friend from school, has her own life and a child. It gives an underlying feeling of sadness to the entire show, despite its cheerful 90s pop exterior. They notice the new ship being built in the Earth's atmosphere and discover that it's an evacuation ship, as a mass of 100 million space monsters are on their way to Earth. Fortunately, Oda is like the most competent person ever and comes up with the idea of collapsing the Excelion's engines in the midst of the enemy fleet, causing a black hole which would destroy them all. Unfortunately, Oda is also dying and has been given around 6 months left to live. Amano and Noriko are asked to pilot the Gunbuster to defend the empty Exelion and hand-deliver it to the enemy, but Amano has a hard time with this. Up until this point, it's been alluded to that Amano and Oda are in a relationship, but we haven't really seen it. These 6 episodes are so jam-packed with things that they really haven't had time to show any of that off. At this point, though, she's being asked to give up the rest of the time that she has with someone that she loves for the rest of humanity. It's a really heavy problem, and it's a theme that Gainax would revisit in works later down the line as well. The mission begins, and I'm not so sure it's a great idea for morale to have an Earth timer in the cockpit. Seeing your fiance's life literally tick away seems like it would be distracting at the very least. Amano finds that hers and Noriko's roles are reversed, as she's the one that experiences a freakout and loses the will to fight. Noriko is able to rouse her battle spirit, and they blast their way through the enemy defensive line, igniting the Excelion's engines directly in the middle of the fleet. 99% of the enemies successfully destroyed, and the Earth is saved. But once again, for how long? Amano is able to reunite with Oda in his hospital bed, and Noriko thinks of her lost friends and experiences, happy to have been part of keeping life going on Earth. This is where the series could have had a satisfying conclusion, and I would have been pretty happy. But there's a lingering feeling that something isn't done yet. Earlier in the series, we learned that the space monster's homeland is the galactic core, the center of the galaxy, while uninhabitable by humans because of its crushing gravity and numerous black holes, makes for a perfect homeland for giant flea crab hybrids, I suppose. The space monsters are also theorized to be some sort of galactic antibody created by the universe to clean up humans, which the scientists think humans might be some sort of universal parasite. It's very Mass Effect Reaper-y, and I didn't really expect it, but it's kind of a background thing. It doesn't really come up much. So with 15 years having passed, we meet back up with Amano. And yes, this episode is in black and white. Some people say this was a cost-cutting measure, but the episode seems to actually be colored in black and white tones in an artistic way. But don't worry, cause Gainax has to cut corners later as always. Amano meets up with Noriko in space, and she hasn't really aged a day as she decided to stay and train with the Gunbuster. While all this was happening, humanity worked on constructing the Buster Unit 3, which is a huge black hole bomb. The plan now is to take this bomb directly to the galactic center and wipe out the space monster's homeland. We can now see the evolution in technology here with both the bridge of the new flagship Eltrium and the black hole bomb itself, which uses a compressed planet Jupiter as its core. When the fleet arrives at the galactic core, they face off with an enemy force that's over 2 billion strong. The humans and the Gunbuster hold out well, though the bomb is damaged in its first wave. It's here that the corners kind of get cut, because the biggest battle in the show is relegated to sound effects and music over panning shots of storyboards. Yeah, Gainax made this show, it's definitely confirmed. Noriko and Amano make the decision to enter the bomb's core and act as a fuse. After an emotional farewell with Young, the human fleet jumps out of the system and heads back to Earth. Noriko and Amano promise to return to Earth no matter how long it takes, and Noriko Janet Jacksons herself. The black hole bomb explodes and the space monster threat is extinguished in a brief moment as the galactic core collapses and the screen fades to black. The Gunbuster floats through space like a corpse, its mechanical ribcage exposed. Noriko and Amano finally drift back in range of Earth as we learn that 12,000 years have passed them by. They wonder aloud if it was all for nothing as the Earth is completely dark. 12,000 years is a long time, and it's possible that Noriko and Amano are the only ones left. But then, when they start to lose hope, we see that the Earth is illuminated by a huge glowing sign simply saying, "Welcome home." The people of Earth never forgot their heroes, not even thousands of years later, and Noriko can finally rest easy as her sacrifices are confirmed to have saved humanity. There we have a look at the directorial debut of Hideaki Anno with Aim for the Top, or as us Westerners got, just Gunbuster. It's funny to think that without this little 6-episode OVA, we may have never gotten the genre's most popular entry, one of its most popular entries in Evangelion. Weighed on its own merits, Gunbuster is a pretty fun time. As someone who loves 90s anime like Yu Yu Hakusho and Dragon Ball Z, this style just makes me feel right at home. The action is well shot and very smooth, but there's actually much less of it than you might think. A lot of Gunbuster focuses on Noriko and the other characters and how they interact with each other. But when action is on screen, it sure is fun to watch. Except the last episode with its storyboard scene battle. Gainax historically struggles with budget and financing issues, and it's just as apparent here as it is in the final episodes of Evangelion. There has also never been an English dub, and at this point there probably never will be, although with the rumored third entry of the series apparently in production, maybe we will get a special edition or something. And of course, because this is a 90s OVA, there are a few scenes with nudity that I would call gratuitous. It's nothing too crazy compared to other stuff from this time period, but if you don't like that sort of thing, you may want to give Gunbuster a skip. Otherwise, it's a pretty good mecha show with some good action and lovable character designs. It's only 6 episodes, so it doesn't overstay its welcome, and although they throw a bunch of fairly complicated science jargon at you, its main story is not that complicated. And there's a sequel that looks to be more of the same with different characters, so if you're left wanting more, you know where to look. As for me, I enjoyed my time with this show, but I think I hear the sound of Gundam calling. Next week, we will be taking a look at Mobile Suit Victory Gundam. See you then! Hey there, and welcome once again to the wonderful end card. If you made it this far, wow, you're wonderful. Thank you for making it this far if you did. I hope you enjoyed this video on Gunbuster. Gunbuster is a weird one because I had never, ever even been interested in watching it before I started this channel, but now here we are, and I'm glad I did. That's part of what makes me excited to do this channel, is I get to just have an excuse to watch a bunch of this old stuff I might not normally get to watch. Coming up next week, though, is Mobile Suit Victory Gundam. That's probably going to be a longer video because I feel like I have a lot to say about it. I'm still not done watching it as of the time of recording this, but by the time you hear it, I most definitely will be, so be on the lookout for that. Also, go ahead, check out my Twitch. I'm going to be streaming a lot more coming up, so again, appreciate it if you made it this far. If you did, please leave a comment below saying that you did, because I want to, you're just like a premium channel member at that point. Anyway, I'm just rambling, so goodbye.